Integration is often misunderstood as recovery, as something that happens after intensity, after collapse, after a hard phase. Recovery implies returning to a previous baseline, getting back to normal, restoring what was lost. But integration is different. Integration is not a return. It is an upgrade. Integration is the process by which experience is absorbed, reorganized, and metabolized by the system, so that what was once challenging no longer needs to be managed or avoided. Nothing is patched over. Nothing is reset. The system becomes more spacious because it has incorporated what passed through it. Within the cycle, integration is not passive downtime. It is an active physiological and perceptual reorganization. It happens when effort drops and awareness remains. When the nervous system is no longer mobilizing toward a goal or defending against threat, it has the opportunity to rewire itself around what was learned. This is why integration cannot be forced. Any attempt to fix, optimize, or improve during this phase pulls the system back into effort and interrupts the very process that allows change to consolidate. Recovery tries to remove symptoms. Integration changes structure. When people skip integration, they often feel like they're repeating the same patterns at a higher level. More insight, more effort, but the same contractions underneath. Integration is what prevents that loop. It's the phase where the body updates its internal maps. What is safe now? What capacity has expanded? What no longer requires vigilance? Without this update, the cycle keeps producing intensity without stability. Integration happens through allowing, not doing. It unfolds when awareness stays with sensation without trying to resolve it. This is where awareness becomes the meeting ground between experience and the body's intelligence. Sensations that were previously overwhelming can now be felt without bracing. Emotions that once triggered contraction can move without narrative. The system is no longer asking, "How do I fix this?" It is discovering, "I can be with this." Awareness meeting sensation is the core mechanism of integration. Not analyzing sensation, not reframing it. Simply staying present as sensation completes its movement. This contact tells the nervous system the experience has been fully lived and no longer needs to be stored as unfinished business. What was once held as tension, urgency, or identity begins to release. Not dramatically, but definitively. This is why integration often feels quiet, subtle, even anticlimactic. There's no peak, no breakthrough moment, just less charge, less story, less effort required to stay regulated. The body no longer needs to keep certain circuits active. Energy that was bound up in managing experience becomes available again. This is how the cycle upgrades itself. Each time awareness meets experience without interference, the system gains capacity. What once required control now requires presence. What once demanded effort now happens naturally. Integration is not something you do after the cycle. It is the phase where the cycle becomes more intelligent.
At this point in the cycle, a quiet but decisive shift occurs. The system stops trying to do healing and begins to allow it. This is where awareness reveals itself not as a tool, but as an intelligence.
It doesn't intervene. It doesn't correct. It doesn't manage. And yet, when it remains present, integration happens. Most effort-based approaches assume change happens through action, understanding more, releasing faster, fixing what feels stuck. But effort always carries tension. It quietly tells the nervous system that something is wrong and must be changed.
Awareness works differently. It doesn't oppose contraction. It doesn't chase resolution. It simply notices what is here, without collapsing into it, and without pushing it away. And in that neutrality, something fundamental changes. When awareness takes the position of the observer, contraction no longer has an opponent. There's no internal resistance left to sustain it. The system stops bracing against its own experience. Sensation that was once bound up in defense, tightness, pressure, heat, heaviness, can now be felt without interpretation. And this alone begins to dissolve contraction, not because it's being worked on, but because it's no longer required. Contraction exists to protect against overwhelm. The moment awareness stays present without effort, the nervous system receives new information. This sensation can be felt without danger. That update is what initiates healing. Not insight, not reframing, but safe contact. As awareness remains steady, sensation is allowed to do what it couldn't do before, complete itself. Sensations aren't static objects. They're movements interrupted by survival responses. Tightness wanted to expand. Trembling wanted to discharge. Emotion wanted to pass through. When effort drops and presence remains, these movements resume on their own. Breath deepens without instruction. Muscles soften without command. Energy reorganizes without intention. This is why awareness isn't passive. It's regulatory. It creates the internal conditions where unfinished physiological responses can resolve. The observer doesn't heal by acting. It heals by not interfering, by staying with sensation long enough for the body to realize that completion is now possible. Many people mistake this phase as doing nothing, but internally, it's one of the most active phases of the cycle. The nervous system is updating. Old threat maps are dissolving. Capacity is expanding quietly. What once triggered urgency no longer does. What once required coping no longer requires attention. When sensation completes itself, it doesn't need to repeat. Patterns dissolve not because they were challenged, but because they're finished. The body doesn't need reminders, affirmations, or discipline to let go of what has fully resolved. This is how the cycle upgrades. Each time awareness stays present instead of moving into effort, the system learns that regulation doesn't require control. Over time, the entire baseline of the cycle shifts. Less energy managing experience. More energy available for action, creativity, and movement. Awareness as healing intelligence is the recognition that nothing needs to be forced. When experience is met fully, it completes naturally. And when completion happens, the system doesn't return to what it was. It becomes something new, without trying to.
One of the most counterintuitive truths of the cycle is that capacity doesn't expand through pushing. It expands through allowing. Most people assume growth comes from stretching past limits, tolerating more pressure, or conditioning themselves to endure discomfort. But that approach builds strain, not capacity. Capacity grows when the system learns it can remain present without contracting, and that learning can't be rushed. Capacity isn't mental strength. It isn't emotional endurance. It's the body's tolerance for sensation, intensity, responsibility, and contact without activating protection. When capacity is limited, the nervous system reads intensity as threat. It tightens, braces, or collapses. When capacity increases, the same intensity can be met with openness. Nothing outside changes. What changes is the system's ability to stay here. This is why integration is so critical. During this phase, the system isn't adding anything new. It's digesting what already happened. Sensation that was once overwhelming can now be felt without urgency. Emotion that once required control can move without destabilizing the system. Each time this happens, the nervous system updates its internal threshold. What was once too much becomes tolerable. What was once avoided no longer requires avoidance. Tolerance increases through repetition, without force. The body learns through experience, not instruction. When awareness stays present with sensation and nothing bad happens, the system recalibrates. It begins to trust that it can stay open longer, feel more deeply, and remain regulated through more. This trust is physiological. It can't be installed through belief or motivation. This is why slow isn't a delay. It's the mechanism. Moving slowly gives the nervous system time to register safety. Fast change can look impressive, but it often bypasses integration. The system may comply for a moment, but it doesn't reorganize. Slow movement lets sensation complete, arousal settle, and meaning dissolve, without being replaced by new strategies. When people try to accelerate growth, they often outrun their capacity. The result is oscillation, expansion followed by collapse, clarity followed by confusion, momentum followed by shutdown. Integration prevents this by letting capacity catch up to experience. It stabilizes progress, so the next cycle begins from a stronger, more regulated baseline. Ease isn't the absence of challenge. Ease is the absence of internal resistance. As capacity expands, the system no longer needs to brace against what's happening. Action becomes cleaner. Decisions require less deliberation. Desire arises without urgency. Rest happens without guilt. Not because life is easier, but because the system isn't fighting itself. Over time, this changes how the entire cycle functions. Expansion feels less dangerous. Contraction is less dramatic. Rest is more effective. Each loop through the cycle builds resilience instead of depleting it. Capacity expanding without force is how sustainability is built, not by doing more, but by needing less effort to remain present. And as presence becomes the norm, strain gives way to ease, without anyone having to make it happen. Integration is the moment the cycle stops repeating itself and starts evolving. Without integration, the cycle loops. Desire arises, energy mobilizes, intensity builds, capacity is exceeded, the system collapses. After rest, the same pattern returns, often with more insight, more intention, but the same physiological limits underneath. Integration is what breaks that loop. It's the turning point where experience is no longer carried forward unchanged. When integration is present, the cycle doesn't reset, it updates. The system doesn't go back to where it started. It begins the next round with more capacity, more tolerance, and less internal friction. The shape of the cycle changes because the nervous system has learned something real, not conceptual, physiological. It learns it can move through intensity without being overwhelmed, rest without disappearing, stay present without needing to protect. This is why integration isn't optional. It determines whether growth accumulates or repeats. Without integration, each cycle extracts a cost. With integration, each cycle builds strength. As the cycle evolves, certain phases soften. Expansion no longer feels like exposure. Action no longer requires over-efforting. Contraction still happens, but it's shorter and cleaner. Collapse becomes less frequent, not because it's avoided, but because it's less necessary. The system has more nuanced ways to regulate. This is what less collapse next time actually means. It doesn't mean constant productivity or uninterrupted momentum. It means the nervous system can downshift without losing coherence. Rest becomes restorative instead of destabilizing. Pauses become pauses, not shutdowns. The system feels limits earlier and responds gently, instead of being forced into exhaustion. Integration also changes how feedback is received. Feedback becomes information, not failure or threat. The cycle adjusts earlier. Desire refines itself. Direction clarifies without crisis. The system no longer needs to hit the wall to learn where its edges are. Over time, the cycle becomes more fluid. Transitions smooth out. Peaks are less volatile. Valleys are less dramatic. This doesn't make life flat. It makes it sustainable. The system gains confidence in its ability to move, rest, and move again. That confidence isn't psychological. It's embodied. It shows up as less urgency, less self-correction, an easier return to presence. Integration is also where identity loosens. Roles built around managing intensity begin to dissolve. Action comes from clarity, not compensation. Leadership comes from regulation, not force. The cycle is no longer something to survive. It becomes something to trust. This is the turning point, not a dramatic breakthrough, but a quiet shift in trajectory. The cycle stops circling the same lessons and starts moving forward. Each round leaves less residue. Each phase requires less recovery. The system becomes more resilient, not by hardening, but by becoming more responsive. Integration is how repetition turns into evolution. It's how the cycle upgrades itself, naturally, incrementally, and without strain.